Well, hello, welcome to another episode of Chronicles Presents, a new little project that we're doing. You may have seen the other couple of videos with Philip Hutchison and Louis Burke by now, where we go for a little walk around areas of London and they show us some of their interesting places and talk about their works and their biographies. But we're doing something a little bit different today. We are staying in one place, a very special edition of Chronicles Presents, a little one-on-one interview with none other than Mr. Dacre Stoker. Hello, Dacre.
How are you, Trevor? Great to see you.
Good to see you again.
Yes, thanks for having me.
So, Dacre, author of Dracula the Undead with Ian Holt in 2009, and then last year's Dracul, co-written with J.D. Barker, also co-editor in between those two with Dr. Elizabeth Miller of the Lost Journal.
That was quite an adventure, yeah.
Obviously, Dracula the Undead, all associated with Dacre's famous forebear.
Yep.
The Irish-born writer of Dracula, Mr. Abraham Bram Stoker. Absolutely. So yeah, good to see you, Dacre.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here in London doing some research on more projects. You know, if you can believe it, still 122 years after Bram wrote this book, people are still finding new and interesting facts about him. And underneath our noses in the London Library, Philip Spedding, the Director of Development, actually found 28 of Bram's research books sitting on the shelves. But the neat thing about that, Trevor, is that it pinpoints London as sort of one of the most important places that kind of planted the seed. Those books, allowing Bram to sort of travel around the world, but right here in London, and go to these places, learn about the superstitions, the mythologies, you know, the vampire stories from the Middle Ages, all the way to the actual travel guides throughout Romania, the maps and so on that helped him plot out this book and make it seem so real.
And you've been able to pinpoint those are the books that he checked out
What's really interesting and a little naughty is that Bram not only checked the books out, and luckily they've been able to identify them, but he went through each of them and along the ways did little check marks. So with pencil, no less, but little marks in the margins, little underlining, little notes that's obvious. Bram sometimes even turned the pages down. But the Philip Spedding, the director of the development there, took this interest when he was reading the book by 18 Bissang and Miller, the Dracula Notes, and noticed the names of these books in the research section of that. And so he went and cross-referenced some of the things that Bram had talked about in the notes to where did they come from, and he found these books with things underlined, and they all lined up. His books, the notes, and then he went to the story of Dracula and found there's a sort of a straight line. So we can see that Bram did have this tendency to be very exact, and notes in the margins and things that make us believe. And I've done a little handwriting analysis. It is Bram's handiwork in the margins.
Wow. So something that would have probably, as you say, been looked down on at the time, made those books quite valuable today.
Well, it's true. I was a little put off when I heard that, and then he said, you know, it's not that uncommon that people would do that. Bram also donated some of his own books that obviously had many more marks on it because they were his own, but his son donated those after. So yeah, a little bit naughty, but not as, you know, nowadays we think it's absolutely verboten to go and write anybody else's book. Our own books in university, we highlight, we underline, and I guess that's really where Bram was sort of coming from.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So one thing we were talking about the other day, because I met Dacre for the first time just last Friday.
Yeah.
David Saunderson from Spooky Isles arranged a bit of a meet-up while Dacre was here in the appropriate and rather nice and snow-covered Spaniards Inn, didn't he? And then
featured in Dracula and
Absolutely.
in Bram's life. Yeah, he spent some time there, probably gathering his thoughts in a pint or two. Yeah.
It's like the stage reading as well that we talked about. Yeah. And then we did a tour with Spooky Isles and myself and Dacre reading.
A Ripper Dracula
on Sunday,
tour,
which was really good.
Which you did a great job at, by the way. Yeah, it was good. Yeah.
But one of the things we were talking about after that briefly that I thought might be worth exploring was you were talking about the reaction to the first book, Dracula the Undead, and the fact that there was in some critical circles, shall we
Right,
say,
sure.
there was a perception that maybe this was a bit of a cash in, and I
Yeah.
suppose by extension what they're saying is exploiting Bram's
The name. Yeah. I mean, and you know, you can see why that happens, because over the years, descendants of famous relatives, you know, do try to jump on the bandwagon and
sometimes they try and make him out to have been Jack the Ripper, which is a strange little side hobby that some people
yes.
have. But yeah.
But yeah, so Ian Holt and I put out a continuation of the story, and I think one of the big things that put people off was the publisher was very quick in the marketing department to say, you know, this is the official sequel. And nobody likes to be told, especially if this is the one official sequel, that, you know, that means all the others aren't any good. And many people have continued Dracula or done their versions of it. And what I learned was a lot of readers, a lot of fans of Dracula movies and TV shows, they develop their own ideas on maybe how the story would have continued. And then along comes this distant relative, you know, years later, and says, well, this is the official one. And really, that was probably the thing I think that offended them the most. And they said, well, therefore, he's a Stoker and he's trying to cash in the name. But I will have to say that the majority of emails and messages I got from people was, how bold of you, thank you. That's an interesting take. I never would have thought of that. But really, our story was picking up 25 years after the story ended, and the young child born at the very end of Dracula is 25 years old now, and he's old enough to ask his parents, just what happened? I've got some hints of things around the household that aren't as settled as they used to be. What happened back then? And of course, he finds some notes and letters. So we've got the ability to sort of look back and sort of, you know, as you say, rattle the cage and bring up some of those old demons that come back as young Quincy Morris finds out what's been going on. And of course, Jack Seward, the doctor, in those days, doctors were prescribing and using morphine, and, you know, many of them did become morphine addicts. And if you think about it, and this was my one thing to sort of wrap this up, the trauma that those band of heroes did to chase Dracula back to Transylvania, they had to themselves kill Lucy. Lucy's mother died, Homewood's father died, Quincy Morris dies at the end, and they put themselves at great risk. Do you think they'd all just turn around and
have some effect
and get on with their life?
Walk off into the sunset, are they?
Right?
No.
It's sort of like, you know, post-traumatic stress syndrome, but it's more like post-Dracula stress syndrome. And what are they going to be like? So that was our take on it. Maybe not official for everybody, but a lot of fun, and a lot of people did enjoy it.
And is that something that you've had to be, is on your mind now, or have you just sort of left that behind?
No, it
or
still
do
is.
you try and be cautious to make sure that you're always doing things in a way that won't be seen as...
Well, that's a direct result on why JD and I wrote Dracul the way we did, is that, number one, we changed the style of writing to the epistolary style.
Yeah.
I've developed as a writer since the Undead. I was not a strong enough writer to do that. If there's any writers out there, epistolary is not easy, because you've got to keep all sorts of things straight, and the inconsistencies can creep up, and timing and things. So, especially when you've got two writers writing different bits. But we did want to come back to Bram's style of writing and write in epistolary style. And this story brings us back to the origins of what I perceive to be Bram's childhood. Of course, I went on all the history that I possibly could, all the research that I could do, and had the benefit of talking to his great-grandsons, my first cousins, who were raised by Bram's son, Noel. So the closest living people to somebody connected to Bram. I got some good stories, which really helped to round out some of the facts of this book. So really about 70% is based on real things, and then we had to fictionalize it to make it, you know, kind of gory, and you know, what would happen if Dracula was real. And I feel that Bram believed that many people did believe vampires were real. And so if so, what happens if the story that Bram wrote was a warning to the world that vampires are real? He couldn't just get up and go off to Scotland Yard or the Metropolitan Police and say, there's vampires around. You know what would happen. He would have been thrown into the insane asylum.
Yeah.
So he writes this story to warn them. And that's what this story is about, is you know, the possibility, if it's real, what would have been like? How do you come across the supernatural?
Which of course fits quite nicely with the original preface.
Exactly.
I can see.
And that was one of the sort of the seminal documents that JD and I looked at. Again, as we said in the Dracula tour, my God, if it's real, maybe there's something here. And that was one of the things that guided us, is that original preface from, it ended up in Iceland. Yeah.
Powers of Darkness, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in the collaborative way of working with the two books, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I've done a collaborative book in the past, but that was non-fiction. There was 4 of us, and it was individual entries, so at least we could divvy them up. I'm interested in how the collaborative process for a fiction book works. Was it different with the 2 different co-authors?
It was very different, because during the Dracula the Undead, we wrote each 2 sections of the book, 2 plot lines. So we had 4 plot lines, and then it was merged together by an editor friend of ours.
Right.
This was, I gave this broad outline of what the story should be, and lots of historical important points. I wrote certain sections that where my expertise was, particularly in the first third of the book, with all the Dublin and the family history, and then Whitby history and things going on. And then JD has a masterful way, because he's a quite established mystery thriller writer. He can, add enough and put the whole thing together so it reads like this great, puzzle-solving thriller mystery.
Interesting. And with JD, I mean, how did you end up getting involved? I've seen a couple of references online saying the Stoker family reached out to JD Bulk. So the Stoker family, is that just you, or is there a wider...
Yeah, I mean, that's one of these things
that you're the front man of.
No, that's exactly. It's one of these things that publicity does. They make it sound very grand. I had this idea in my mind: what if Dracula was real? How do I get the story done? So I had been developing the story. I read one of JD's books called Forsaken, which was wonderful, and it had the approach to it that I wanted. So I did contact my cousins, who okayed the Undead, and I said, hey, what if I write this? Are you going to be okay with it? I'll go find myself, a really good writer that I can work with who can do this type of story. So I met the Horror Writers Association, and I'm sort of nervously, figuring out how to pitch this to this guy. And it turns out that we're seated right next to each other for a 2-hour author signing. I'm doing Undead, and he's doing Forsaken. And I say, I think it was, Trevor, in a way. And in a time I said, hey, do you think you'd ever, in free time, do you think you'd ever like to write a book? I got an idea, I'd like to pitch you. Let's have breakfast tomorrow morning. And so, that's how it really came about. Yeah.
And so, I mean, for having met you a couple of times now, I would say you're probably, you're certainly not exploiting anything. I would say that actually, if I had to characterise you, if I may, you're probably the biggest advocate for Bram Stoker, the person, around, really.
Yeah.
And from what you said, the London Library, I know you've been down here doing a lot of other research at the British Library and elsewhere.
Yeah, the staged reading is actually at the British Library, and I was digging into that with 2 other experts to figure out how did that come around, and what did he take out and things like that. So I am interested.
You're very keen in putting him in context, as opposed to just being Bram, the writer of this seminal book, aren't you?
Trevor, that's it. It's more than writing something and using that knowledge. I want to get to know him. So little is known, and in some of the cases, and I won't name names of biographers, but some of them haven't taken the time. They regurgitate a lot of the same old, or some of them have their agenda. But I like to read, and I'm in the process of, now that the London Library has found all these books that Bram has read, of working my way through and buying, these print-on-demand modern copies of some of these books to read what was entering Bram's mind. If he read these 28 books, and he put notes only on some of them, but he read the whole book to be able to note the whole thing. So obviously, he's getting into his mind all this information. So not all of it was used in Dracula. He wrote 12 other novels, lots of short stories. He worked in the stage, so many things would have entered into his mind. He touched many lives in many ways, and I'm looking at figuring out the whole guy.
As far as parts of Bram's life that, as you say, are sometimes glossed over slightly.
Yeah.
I know Christopher Frayling, for example, has been quite critical of the idea of any Irish influence in Bram's life, but that's something that the journal, the Lost Journal that you edited with Dr. Elizabeth Miller, you seem to be very much trying to put that back into the story.
Well, certainly. I mean, you know, he lived there from 1847 till 1879, and he wrote a few books, you know, stories there. He wrote Snake's Pass there, but those are just the things sort of we know of because he's published them. He also published a legal manual, the duties of clerks of petty sessions. Well, that would have meant that he traveled all over the country, which is a little unusual back at the time. He made a statement as a inspector of the clerks of petty sessions that things weren't right because he paid himself to publish that book. So this manual, he realized he needed to organize things, which is typical Bram. So he went to his bosses and said, well, I'm going to publish this book. And this book was still in use through 1960. So that's a little bit of his contributions to Ireland. But also, he seemed to be a very proud Irishman all his life. And he didn't sort of hide that, even though he moved here, even at times when it probably wasn't all that easy for an Irishman in London to work. But he was a upstanding, honest man. He did a hard day's work at the Lyceum Theatre, and he kept that sort of Irish spirit. And all you have to do is read some of his obituaries. Many people mentioned that. And so that's an interesting side. But I think what Frayling may have been referring to is, did he really toil in the politics and get
Parnell?
Yeah, that just, I don't think that was maybe in the back of his mind. But you also have to realize, as a theater manager, he had to be very neutral because he had to attract people to come to watch Henry Irving and the whole, that whole troupe do their thing, and he had to get people to donate money. He was looking for patrons, so he couldn't be a controversial, sort of politically leaning guy.
No, not openly at least.
Openly, yeah. Exactly, and I think that's the same with some of his other ideas. He was a Freemason. He was, we know he went to a couple of meetings of the Old Order of the Golden Dawn. He was very interested in inserted into Dracula some fringe sciences and new technology. So some of his own personality did come out in his writing more than he could actually put out in conversation in real life at the risk of being controversial. I also think that he would have been affected by, wonderful old Irish folklore and mythologies as we inserted into Dracul. Because, he was one of 7 kids. It wasn't just all by himself. So it was a big, robust family with everybody, being educated around the country, in his sisters in the arts and the brothers in sciences. And as a civil servant, you would certainly know everything going on, at least in Dublin Castle.
Interesting. So just come back to go on to you for a minute and how you fit in that. Fits quite well because you were saying about Bram being one of 7 children. Yeah. And of course, where you come in is your great-grandfather, the youngest.
That's right, youngest
of those
brother,
children.
Yeah.
So how did
that
that branch end up in Canada?
Well, Bram's youngest brother George had 2 children. Tom Thornley Stoker came to Canada after World War I, looking for a war bride, looking for opportunity. He came to Montreal, and he actually was a businessman, and he started the Montreal Stock Exchange. Funnily enough,
okay.
It's quite successful. And he met who was obviously my grandmother, and that sort of started the Stokers on that side of the country. George's daughter Sheila never married, so there was no offspring there. But luckily, Tom Thornley and my grandmother did. They had 3 children. One died in World War II, and my father and his brother were too young to serve, and they got on. Well, one was a stockbroker, one was an architect. So there's 6 offspring left from that branch. And then just the far other side of the country, one of Bram's other brothers, Richard Stoker, went to India first as a civil servant and a doctor, but he was headed to Australia and stopped in Vancouver, British Columbia, and liked it so much he decided to stay.
Left.
So the joke in the family is the 2 Stokers, the bookends of the continent, one in British Columbia, one in Montreal, Quebec, and we sort of filled in a little bit in between.
Excellent. And I mean, I know this is a story you've told many times before. It's up in almost every interview, but for completeness, we should probably include it. The inevitable question, how did you become aware? So the Halloween story, you know what I'm getting at.
The Halloween story. Yeah, it is a question because, you grow up as a relative of some famous person, and you wonder, number one, how aware were you? When did it happen? And how does it affected your life? And in reality, you've got to also put this in perspective, like Bram and Dracula in the Victorian era. Up until about the early 70s, not until McNally and Florescu really wrote about Bram Stoker and discovered the Dracula notes did people really connect Bram to Vlad and Count Dracula. Yes, they knew that, but they didn't know much what was the connection. And so as a kid growing up in Montreal, Canada, we weren't really targeted. But when this article came out and the book came out by McNally and Florescu, late 60s, early 70s, then sort of the friends would come around at Halloween going, Count Dracula, what's going to happen when we come to the Stoker household? Are you going to, take our blood, or, you're going to give us candy? And then, that sort of went on. And after enough of that, I guess I was 12 or something, said to my dad, okay, what's going on? And he reached up into this bookcase and pulled out a copy of Dracula and some of the other first editions we had that had made their way to George and then on to us. And he explained it to me, but he didn't know that much either. Luckily, somebody from New York had sent up in an envelope the article about McNally and Florescu going to the Rosenbach Museum looking for a woodcut of Vlad, and they were presented with the Dracula notes, and they included that in their book, In Search of Dracula. That's when we learned more. And then sort of time goes on, and we're in touch. Of course, no internet, it's lots of phone calls with our cousins over here in Oxford and Isle of Wight, and learn more and more as we go on.
And had you had any literary ambitions of your own before that?
As little as possible, really? To be honest.
You sportsman at first.
Well, that's the thing is, I didn't have a lot of time to read books, let alone write anything. Some pleasure books, just escapism stuff, Tolkien and Clive Cussler and all that. And then, life kind of got serious, and I became a teacher, and got a little more interested in writing reports and papers and all that. But it wasn't until Ian Holt really sort of called me up in 2003 and said, what about this? I've got a screenplay and it needs to be adapted, and can we turn this into a story? We need some research. Are you interested in doing it? And I was sort of at a crossroads and said, well, if we can find good editors, I'll try writing. And it's just been sort of an uphill struggle all that time. And I find good people to help me do it, combine my research, combine ideas, and good editors do help you look good.
This chap has made his way onto the table.
And
just before we started, Dacre was presented these to us and was suggesting we discuss them at some point, so it seems like a good opportunity. And let's talk about tourism in Romania, of all things.
I mean, much like you do over here and run your tours, your Jack the Ripper tours, I've taken it upon myself to lead people to Romania, specifically the Transylvanian province, to show people where the action in Bram's novel took place, retrace the steps of Harker and the band of heroes and the Count and all that. But also along the way, I've realized it's just as interesting to sort of trace Vlad Dracula the Impaler, the prince of Wallachia, who Bram turned into Count Dracula of Transylvania. And sort of one of the funny things, I was invited to come over for a tourist branding conference by the Romanian government. And I said, you guys do a wonderful job, but you confuse these. Lots of tourism places I go will say, oh, Count Dracula in this castle and this, and they get them all mixed up. And I said, you need to split them. So, sort of like, we say the streams shall not cross in Ghostbusters. Create two streams of tourism, bring your people over and show them where Vlad lived and reigned and impaled people and all the interesting stuff he did for 7.5 years to hold off the Muslim Empire from, crushing Christianity. And then the fictional guy, Count Dracula, where did that take place? Because it really is, coming over for half the country, from Budapest to Bistrița and up into the mountains. And at the end of the story, they come all the way down from the bottom, from Galati, Bucharest, and up into the mountains. So the Count and his people cover a lot of the country, and Vlad only is in a little bit of the country. But together, you've got a wonderful opportunity for which I do these 1-week tours to show people as much as we can, and it's a lot of fun.
It sounds good.
Much like your tours.
The Romanian government behind it as well. So that's
they're trying hard to do proper exploitation of their products, and this is one of them. But up until before communism fell, Ceausescu did not even allow the book to be sold and Dracula be sold. Namely, that was Western decadence. And so they're really playing catch up. And when they see about the movies and the books and the Halloween costumes, it's all pretty new and pretty crazy, and they jump on the bandwagon without really filtering it too well and thinking, what's the proper way, like yourself, a tour guide who knows what he's doing and gives the proper facts with the right audiovisual equipment, as opposed to somebody just rambling off something in the middle of nowhere, without much collective organization of some unifying body. And that's what they need to do, and they're getting better at it.
Interesting. There was talk of writing a travel guide at some point. Does that link into?
Well, it does, because
that be a guide to Romania.
While I was there, it was, let's take a chunk of Romania and help people who don't come on a tour but want to go on their own, or just do it by a book, and also go to other places where the story took place, which obviously Dracula took place in London, in Whitby, and in Romania. But what's happened is I've realized that trying to turn this information into a travel guide is too specialized. So what I've been working on is instead one of these books, like 100 places you need to go, that inspired Bram to write Dracula. So that travel guide has sort of taken a bit of a turn, and it's becoming one of these location based. So we'll still go to Transylvania, but we'll come to London, look at the Lyceum, and we'll look at Golders Green where he's buried. And
so you're bringing in the real life.
The real life
as
things.
well, yeah.
Well, the London Library, the British Library, Marsh's Library in Dublin. We'll go to Cruden Bay, Scotland, where Bram actually spent 13 summers and wrote the stories. 3 stories: Dracula, Mystery of the Sea, and Water's Mouth. We'll go to Whitby, where he was only once, but set chapters 6, 7, and 8 there.
Yeah, Whitby's an interesting part of the story, isn't it? Because as you say, it's not actually in it that much, but if you don't know much about Dracula, probably one of the few things you do know is, or think you know, is it's all in Whitby, isn't it? That's where you have the conventions.
They have these 2 goth festivals.
It's developed this importance that's much wider than its actual importance in the story, hasn't it?
Isn't that wonderful, really? But it shows that Bram, his legacy, this book, has created tremendous following, and so people flock to this place, much like, I understand, they flock to New Zealand to go see where The Hobbit was filmed. They go to Rome to see where Angels and Demons and Da Vinci Code took place and follow that around. Well, they go to Whitby for reenacting and walking around the town to see where Mina chased after Lucy, where the graveyard is, and the 199 steps, and where the Demeter landed. So it was very specific, the places that Bram put it, therefore it makes it easy to follow. And it's a wonderful, picturesque town, even when you don't play goth or play Dracula there.
No, it is. Lovely place. Good fish and chips as well.
Yes.
Come back to Bram's life a little bit. Something I heard you saying, and I hadn't come across it, but before, something I heard you saying in an interview I was listening to in preparation for this, the cholera story, which now, having read this, I can see where it's obviously in your mind when you then went on drugs. But that's really interesting. So that was a story that his mother told him. Is that right?
During the 7 years of his life, when he was infirmed, mysterious ailment, I think it's respiratory allergies and asthma. So it would have been a very difficult 7 years for a little boy, sleeping on mattress made out of straw, pillow with straw or feathers, and having these allergies, and having difficulty breathing from time to time. Gets told many stories over 7 years, obviously. One in particular we do know for sure, because that story of Charlotte Stoker growing up in Sligo in 1832 during the cholera epidemic, where they had no idea what was causing these deaths. It was horrifying. But it also had a neighbor of Charlotte Blake being buried, misdiagnosed, and put into the grave before the person was dead. And the husband came back after the workday and went down to pay his last respects to his wife. And the fact that he had put a red scarf around her, he made it easy to find, to give her a hug and a kiss. There she was still alive, and he dragged her out. So this idea, and that was not the only case of premature burial, obviously stuck in Bram's mind. Because years later, when he set off to write a children's book of horror stories for kids, he wrote a letter to his mother, who was now living in France after the father had retired, and they took the girls off there so they could be better educated in the arts. Would you please send me that story? So that story was typed up and now sits in Trinity College Library. And Bram used that story as the basis for one of his children's story in Under the Sunset. So we know that Bram was read that. I think it was influential in sort of almost some latent trauma that was in the back of poor old Bram's childhood brain when he was maybe thinking he'd be misdiagnosed. And then years later, when he's studying at the British Library and the London Library and sees all these accounts of vampires coming out of the grave and sucking the blood of the living when it's really the plague, he puts all links them all up. Absolutely. The personal experience to the actual reading of what he perceives to be relevant and maybe real events.
Have you got any idea of, let's go back to the time that he's writing Dracula, before it comes out. So obviously he's Henry Irving's manager effectively at the Lyceum. He's, as you say, got this legal civil service background. He's published the textbook for the clerks of the court, which was in use until the 1960s, wasn't it, I think? So quite successful in those elements of his life. If you read a bit about Irving as well, he's probably one of the few people who could sort of knew quite how to deal with Irving as well, which was
right.
a
They had a special
itself.
Relationship to sort of keep Irving on the straight and narrow, because he's very extravagant and all this. But Bram, he needed a Bram to make sure everything functioned properly, paid the bills on time, and all that. Yeah.
So, I mean, have you got any sense of how he would have viewed himself at the time? Did he always have ambitions to be a successful writer, or would he have considered himself more a theatrical man who also wrote? Or
that's a great question. I believe, from all the research I did when Elizabeth Miller and I were deciphering and following up on all the leads on the Lost Journal, that Bram, as a university student, younger man, did have designs on being an actor himself. Enjoyed going to the theater, was writing theatrical reviews, but also in this journal was practicing poetry, practicing short stories, was quite a romantic, was also using his writing in his journal as an experience of recording things that he would see. He was very aware of many details, social details, but architectural things, funny, humorous, grotesque, all kinds of things. So it was sort of the practicing palette of a writer. But we found out later that he was also an artist at the same time. So he was a founding member of the Dublin Painting and Sketching Club. So he never went on, obviously, to do it professionally, but lots of little sketches and things. So he is this creative soul. The fact is, though, that he had to become a clerk to make money for the family as the dad retired. When he gets his big chance to go off with Irving to come to London, it's obvious that this is a job that requires his sort of mathematics background, his organizational skills. And at that time, I think he fashions himself as, I can give a little creative input on some of these plays, which we know, we have seen in some of these books that he has done some editing of plays that maybe Irving that says, well, we could do that. So he had a hand in that. But what I think is most important, Trevor, is when it came to his writing, it was just him. He wasn't doing something for Irving or needed Irving's approval. It was my thing. Short stories, newspaper articles, and then these novels. And so this is sort of nice to see that in his own way he's able to flourish, develop, and do something that he could sort of stand up for. Even though he wasn't sort of a, look at me, I'm the writer. This is nice to make a little extra money. But I think deep down inside, it was that confidence.
That was his expression.
It is his expression, and he could do it for himself, even though it was most of it was done, as we now understand, on his holiday times in Cruden Bay, or when he's crossing the ocean 16 times, 8 times to the U.S. and back for the Lyceum Theater. So plenty of time in these ships, a month's time. So it's his free time job that he does the writing, and I think that was important to him.
So you said about, it's a very good opportunity to work into the next question. You said about Bram having some influence potentially on the creative side of the theatre productions.
Yeah.
And of course, there were plans, it's something I've always found interesting, the Dracula play that never happened. There were plans almost straight after publication, weren't there? I think for Richard Mansfield to be involved playing Dracula, and then it doesn't transpire until 1924 with the Hamilton Dean and Bela Lugosi.
That's right. We know there's certain things we know and certain things we use circumstantial evidence for. We know that Bram needed to do a staged reading to protect the copyright of the dramatic rights of the book, which he did, and the actual script. And only one script was made. It was cut all out of a book and some notes by Bram sitting in the British Library, 162 pages of it, and it was read just a few days before the book came out. I understand that this lady Sylvia Starshine has published that, and it was 100 years later that Sylvia Starshine, from her book, did a reenactment at Spaniard's Inn. So what happened then was, for whatever reason, Irving, when he walked through the Lyceum Theater and just passed on through and saw all of his friends, workers, it wasn't just the actors, it was stagehands and so on that were reading this one script passed around, just to really fulfill a legal requirement with 3 people watching as witnesses. He wandered through and said, "Dreadful." Now, in context or out of context, did that mean, oh, a laborious piece of work to get this done, or was he judging and say, this is dreadful? Really don't know. Some people have said Irving didn't think it was worth anything. Others have said, well, wait a sec, Bram uses the term dreadful in Dracula as horrifying. And maybe Irving meant that. We'll never know. But what we do know is that there wasn't a stage production until after Bram died. And Florence tried to make her own adaptation and get a writer to do that for her to her liking, which apparently didn't work until Hamilton Dean came along and said, let me try. And apparently he got the blessing of Florence after a while. And the two of them collaborated. I don't think she did too much other than having her name on it and getting some royalties. And then at some time later, John Balderston got involved and then brought this thing to the U.S. with Dean. So Florence was involved economically with Dean and Balderston to sort of gain some money from the sale of U.S. rights, which ended up with Ray Huntley and Lugosi playing in it. And then years later, that got sold to Universal and then on to Hammer. So Florence Stoker lived quite comfortably with the proceeds of the stage dramatic rights as well as the movie rights. In fact, my cousins tell me that the 2 fishing cabins that they, I guess that's what they call them, and they're more than just that, on the Isle of Wight, were a result of the Dracula film money. So those were bought and then merged together. And what's really kind of strange and interesting is that that's where the Stoker family went during the bombings of World War II. And their neighborhoods were affected by the bombing. And so they seek refuge on the Isle of Wight, which their era wasn't bombed. And so, and again, one of these funny ways, they say the Dracula films saved them from the bombing of the Germans.
Absolutely. Interesting. Bit of trouble publishing Dracula initially. Bram always mentioned, a couple of publishers, perhaps a little bit, suggestion that people were a bit nervous about publishing it at the time. I've seen raised. I've never seen any source for that.
No,
so I was just wondering.
No, I haven't either.
No.
All I heard was that there was Ed. I mean, maybe he settled on Archibald Constable because Bram had his hand in a lot of things, and he was, pretty smart guy. Wrote a lot of the contracts, then that he creates the contracts to the publishers and tried his hand in publishing himself. But I know that editing was an issue. And
obviously the preface disappears.
And the first 101 pages disappears. Yes. Otto Keilman, a friend of mine in Dublin, has a letter that's back and forth. It's why are you doing this? And so there was definitely some friction. I think probably all creative works are going to have things like that surrounding them. But one of the interesting mysteries about this book is that where is the first 101 pages? And is Dracula's guest?
I was going to ask, where do you think that fits in? Because a lot of people take that to be chapter 1.
Right. Well, Trevor, here's what I know, and it's not everything, but 101 pages, the typescript that Paul Allen's estate, the fellow that died some months ago, that is a co-founder of Microsoft, owns the Dracula typescript. It's a manuscript, but it's typed, so it's a typescript. And it starts on page 102. So obviously there was 101 pages at one time, early on. Dracula's Guest was published in 1914, 2 years after Bram died, by his widow, along with some other stories by Routledge Company. And in it, she says in the preface, I hope some of the readers of my husband's most famous work will enjoy this story that was excised from the story due to length. Okay, it could be like the preface, a little bit of pulling your leg, or it could be truth. But it's only 17 pages. But it does fit, because it's a story of a Jonathan Harker character en route to Transylvania, but he stops in Munich. And he has an interesting experience. I won't ruin it for your viewers, but read it. It's really quite cool. I have analyzed the typescript and found 3 direct references in the typescript that were crossed out by Bram that happened in Dracula's Guest. So my theory is he had to take it out for whatever reason. He continues with the story, and he has to go through the typescript and go, oh, wait a sec, I have to take out all those references to whatever I've taken out. So he takes out these crosses out these things. And so therefore, I think it was in the story quite late. Because if he goes the trouble of creating a typescript with references to something he's taken out, it probably would have been, because we also found stamps on the back of the pages showing that he took this manuscript to a typing service. He didn't do it himself. So he's not going to go and spend a lot of money to have many different 480-page manuscripts.
The references are still there in a fairly late version.
That's what I'm saying, yeah.
Yes. Probably shouldn't. I'm intrigued by the idea of that typescript in the Paul Allen story, but I know there was all sorts of secrecy around it, wasn't there? So maybe we shouldn't explore that too much.
Yeah, it is, and it's some good secret still that it may give up in time with more analysis. There is the ending that was changed. That's occasionally, and it's going to be. I am working on an annotated Dracula with a scholar, Robert 18 Basang, where we will fully explain, because he's had the chance to analyze the typescript for actually longer than I did and took many notes. But we'll bring into play that the end of Dracula, right after the knife, and I say knife went into Dracula, not a stake, and his throat was slit with a kukri blade, a massive volcanic eruption occurs, and Castle Dracula crumbles. That was cut out. You can still see it plain as day. He actually didn't cut it this way. He just put big chunks of line this way so you can read it easily. So that was a change. Why a less than definitive ending to the story?
You ever consider that the suspicion was he trying to set it up for a sequel?
Yeah, maybe he was. It's the only book that he took 7 years to write. Or maybe he was foreshadowing that somebody in the family would come and write a sequel many years ago.
Well, maybe.
Who knows? Yeah.
Well, that's been very interesting, Dacre. Thank you very much. I should probably let you go on. I know you're a busy man while you're here in London this week. What plans you got? London Library?
I've got the London Library. I'm going to go see I've seen it once already, but the London Library is putting on a very interesting 2-person adaptation of Dracula, put on by a company called Creation Theatre. Robert Bissang and I went and saw it on its opening night as a preview. There's a lot of energy. Of course, it's only 2 people, and they morph to many of the characters. Lots of cool technology. Wonderful 2-hour show. So I've got that to do. I'm going to go stick my nose and just do some non-Dracula stuff. I'm going to go sniff around the British Museum while I'm here before I head back.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everybody for watching. Keep an eye out for more episodes of Chronicles Presents, and of course chronicles-uk.com. Do please check out Dracul. It is genuinely very good. I'm not just saying that.
And when I've just found out, interesting news for people,
Yeah.
when the soft cover comes out in October, we're going to be slipping in that cholera story as an appendix,
Excellent.
as an extra added bonus to really let people know, what Bram's mother told him, the whole story, not just the reference to it.
Brilliant. And on the unlikely event you haven't read this book here, you may not be able to get hold of one of these very valuable 6th editions that Dacre has let me get my greasy paws over today.
But you can find them almost anywhere, yeah.
And Dacre Stoker, BramStokerEstate.com,
Yep.
I believe is the website. Okay, yeah. Well, thank you very much, and see you on the streets. Thanks, Dacre.
All right. Thanks, Trevor.